Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. And as Mike said, first I would like to thank so much the people that made the Glazov Gang possible, which are my producers, Annie, Rasheen, and Reza. Please, everybody, give them a hand. You guys want to come up here so everybody can see you, no? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Jihad on the offensive. Let's get right to it because the wise men on our panel have a lot of more intelligent things to say than I do. I think I would just like to say, first of all, on a personal note, in these dire and frightening times, with all jokes aside, it is such an honor to be with three really brave truth tellers. So even before we start, let's give them a hand, ladies and gentlemen. And starting in the left corner, Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch and author of two New York Times bestsellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades and The Truth About Muhammad. His latest book is Arab Winter Comes to America, The Truth About the War We're In. And he's a former trainer to the FBI and US military. And perhaps today he'll talk a little bit about the tragedy of the fact that it's curious individuals now that are teaching the FBI and US military instead of a person like him. And in the middle, a former bodybuilding champion, am I correct, Raymond?
Yeah.
He might even show us a picture of his former sculpted self or still sculpted self. Raymond Ibrahim, a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center.
Thank you.
And our Shillman Fellowship has made Front Page the great success that it is. And Bob Shillman, thank you once again for everything you've done for Front Page. He is Judith Friedman Rosen Writing Fellow at the Middle East Forum, and Raymond is also a CBN News contributor. And he is the author of Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, and the Al-Qaeda Reader. And he's also fluent in Arabic and can translate, and this is a great strength and contribution to us, because as we know, we're often accused of not knowing the real Arabic when it comes to the Quran. And last but not least, the man, the myth, and the legend, Bruce Thornton. He is also a Freedom Center Shillman Fellow and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of classics and humanities at the California State University. His latest book is Democracy's Dangers and Discontents, The Tyranny of the Majority from Athens to Obama. Let's give them a hand, ladies and gentlemen. So, gentlemen, our panel this morning, not this evening, is Jihad on the Offensive. I'd like to start with Raymond Ibrahim. You gave me a nudge last night saying there's something really on your mind lately. Let's begin with that, because I think that's an excellent way to begin. The accusation, I think, to the best of my memory, about truth tellers about Islam being conflated with haters of Muslims.
Right.
Let us begin with that and the slander that that represents, and perhaps how we need to fight that.
Sure. Thanks, Jamie. The point that I'd like to bring forward is there's a number of apologetics, if you want to use that word, that are offered whenever the topic of Islam comes up, radical Islam, violence, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's always important to try to show the flaws of these, because some of them are immensely popular. One of them, for example, is the whole, well, if the Quran has violence, well, so does the Bible, the Jewish scriptures, Old Testament, Revelation has an apocalyptic scenario, violence, et cetera, et cetera. And I've addressed that a lot of times, and I think many of you may be familiar with the proper response to that. But what I'd like to discuss now is it seems almost every time you talk about radical Islam, jihadism, et cetera, whether you want to put the word radical in there or not is irrelevant. I do it because you just get used to it. But Islam, Islamic violence, and all this sort of thing, the immediate response that you'll often get, and many of you, I'm sure, if you have this debate with people, is, well, you know what, the majority of the Muslims around the world are not doing this. And, the Muslim I know down here doesn't do this. And so it becomes this idea that because Muslims, perhaps the majority, are not engaged in jihad, therefore that is not the correct understanding. So I actually have an analogy that I could offer, which is basically Nazism, or Nazi Germany and so forth. Nazism, I think today, of course, we can all look back and say it was a very bad ideology, and it's something that everyone would have to condemn, of course. unless you are a Nazi still. But your average person, of course, we have no problem going up publicly and saying it's a terrible, ideology and so forth. But we also know from a historical point of view that when you go back in the Nazi era, there were Germans who were self-proclaimed Nazis and who were not so bad. Schindler's, for example, the movie Schindler's List and so forth. These were people who were Nazis, who sympathized perhaps with the regime and whatnot, but they did good things and they didn't do bad things. They weren't, for example, all about trying to burn people and the Holocaust and so forth. They would reject that. So my point is, yes, you will always have these people who do good or do not do the teachings that are bad, to stick with the Nazi analogy. But it's always, as you would know, this is a reflection not of Nazism. It's a reflection of them. In other words, they were this way in spite of Nazism, not because they were practicing a moderate form of Nazism. And it's this sort of paradigm that I would like to see transferred over to the Muslim debate, whereby we can say that Islam is what it is. It is an ideology. It does call for warfare, subjugation of the non-Muslim, imperialism, all sorts of things that we see. Yes, that is Islam. Now, that does not mean, of course, every single Muslim is doing that, but that's not a reflection of some good kind of Islam. And I think when you understand that, you start to realize, well, you're not condemning 1.5 billion people, as the number is often given, but you do need to understand that the ideology itself can be condemned. And I think we should be able to condemn this ideology. And we're not talking about the people. Sure, there's the Muslims who follow this ideology. These are the bad guys who are known as Islamists and so forth. There's the Muslims that may not follow it. But then that's not because they're following anything else. It's just they happen to be nominal Muslims, and some of them are good people. So I bring this again because this is the number one kind of pushback I get whenever I talk about the Islam question. What about the real Muslims? You're just talking theory. Look at all the millions who don't do this. So I think it's important, based on what we were talking about, Jamie and I, to make this strong distinction. It's okay for us to condemn an ideology because it is what it is, black and white, violence and so forth. But that's not saying every single guy that is born, I mean, think of how many Muslims are just born into it. They don't even know their religion and they can't leave it because of the apostasy penalty and so forth. So, but these people should never represent to us the true Islam. They're just the nominals, kind of like the Germans under Nazi era who didn't do the sorts of things. So that was basically the point I thought would be good to make.
Thank you, Raymond. Oh, and let's go to Bruce. Your thoughts on Raymond's wise words?
No, I think he's right. I think you could also look at another analogy, and this I found in Nathan Sharansky's book, and I never remember the title of it. It's the one that George Bush carried around, Case for Democracy, thank you. And you may remember he talked about there were the true believers. On the other side were the activists, dissidents, actively working against it. And the vast middle were what he called double thinkers. They didn't work against or reject the doctrine. And I think you have something analogous, and very careful with this analogy. But as Raymond said, you have millions, hundreds of millions perhaps, of Muslims who will never put on a suicide vest, who will not make the journey to northern Iraq to actually fight, will not become a member of a cell. But they believe in the same doctrines that those who will do those things believe in. And that's the point. Secondly, they don't actively resist those who are committing terror because they know those people have the better case. And what we fantasize, not we, you know, they, about moderate Muslims is they know that an Al-Qaeda, Zawahiri, all these guys, they can cite chapter, verse, Quran, Hadith, 14 centuries of commentary on these, and they know they have an argument, and a moderate Muslim does not have an argument against that, because an argument against that is an argument against the religion totally. And they're not going to do that. Second point, very quickly, when you look at it from that perspective, you realize then that most of the trouble comes from the hardcore. Now, our problem is we don't know how large that is out of 1.5 billion Muslims. It doesn't have to be huge, does it? Because 10% of that is 150 Muslims. So you know, whether it's a majority or minority, if we trust Pew polls, which consistently show high levels of support for things like Sharia law, et cetera, it might be bigger than that. And it puts me in mind of something that William Sherman said during the Civil War. Sherman had lived in the South, and was living in the South when the war broke out, so he knew the Southern people. And at some point he said, in a letter, he said, there are 300,000 Southerners that you're going to have to kill, right? There's nothing that's going to get them to change their mind. You're not going to convert them by argument. You're not going to bribe them. There's no inducement you have. He said they're good riders, good fighters, they're brave men. They have to die. When they die, then the others who may agree with them in their principles will give up. And I think we have something of the same today, only I think the proportion would be much higher in terms of the Muslim world. And this, let me finish with a melancholy fact of history, is that when you have two different ideologies, whether religious or the slavocracy ideology, race-based, or whatever it is, or Nazism versus liberal democracy, or communism versus liberal democracy, those kinds of disputes are not settled through negotiation. They're not settled through finding common ground. They're only settled by force. They only are settled by killing lots and lots of people until you killed enough to where they will give up. That's how World War II was fought. The only reason that the war with communism didn't follow that pattern is because there was a mutually assured destruction, and both sides had an interest in not settling it that way. But communism was an atheist ideology in which there's only this world. Iran has a particular brand of Islam that is messianic and apocalyptic, and we can sit here and wonder whether they really don't believe in what they say they believe in. But we should have learned from our experience in the 30s when every atrocity that Hitler and the Nazis ended up doing was all laid out in Mein Kampf, and then was repeated during the early 30s at the party rallies in Nuremberg. And nobody took it seriously. Said, well, they don't really mean that. I think it's the idea that when they say, particularly if you're Israel, if they say we want to wipe you off the map, you better believe they want to wipe you off the map, and then you better do something about it.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Robert?
Well, I hate to bring bad news, but that's really all I do, actually. The fact is, people have been asking me yesterday and today, as well as at pretty much everywhere else that I speak, what can we do to encourage the moderates? And I've got to tell you that there are moderate Muslims, but there is no moderate Islam. That is an unpleasant fact, but it is a fact, and I'll explain. Now, moderate Muslims, people usually assume that that means Muslims who believe different things from the jihadis, that they don't believe that it is part of their religious responsibility to wage war against unbelievers. They don't believe that they should hate Jews and kill them. They don't believe that they should subjugate women and non-Muslims as inferiors in the society under an institutionalized system of discrimination and harassment. There is actually no such Islam. People talk in the West and they take advantage of our ignorance about Islam to mislead people into complacency. I'll give you an example. There is a 512-page fatwa against terrorism by a Pakistani Islamic theologian named Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri. And about 5 or 10 times a day, Muslims write to me and they say, you say Islam is not a religion of peace, you should read Tahir al-Qadri. So I did. And luckily, you know, it's the wonders of the internet age, I was able to get a PDF and search it. And so what I did was I searched it for the Quran passages that exhort Muslims to commit violence and wage war against unbelievers. Because if he's really going to be presenting an alternative form of Islam, then it would be just commonsensical, would it not, for him to take up those passages and explain why Muslims should not take them as marching orders today. And I searched for chapter 9, verse 5, slay them wherever you find them. Chapter 4, verse 89, slay them wherever you find them. Chapter 2, verse 191, slay them wherever you find them. Chapter 9, verse 29, fight against the Jews and the Christians until they're subjugated and pay the tax. Chapter 47, verse 4, when you meet the unbelievers, strike at their necks, behead them. And others of that kind. 512 pages, he never mentioned any of those verses. Now, do you understand the implications of that? This is supposed to be a piece saying that terrorism is wrong and Muslims should not engage in it, and he never addressed any of the justifications that the jihad terrorists use to show that what they're doing is Islamically correct. That's not a reform kind of Islam. That's not a moderate Islam. That's a big, extensive, elaborate effort to deceive unbelievers and make us ignorant and complacent about the jihad threat. You cannot reform something. You cannot fix a problem without acknowledging that there's a problem, you see. And there is no moderate Islam. There is no version of Islam that does not teach warfare against unbelievers and their subjugation. It's just like this. This does not mean, as Raymond and Bruce were saying, that all Muslims are doing this or all Muslims are even on board with this. But it's just like in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church teaches, as part of its official teaching from the Pope and so on, contraception is wrong, contraception is immoral, don't contracept. Survey after survey shows that 70, 80, 90% of Catholics use contraception. Now, we would be absolutely wrong, incorrect, to say that, oh, that means that the church doesn't really teach that contraception is wrong. It really does. It's just that most Catholics don't pay attention. Islam really teaches warfare against unbelievers. A lot of Muslims don't pay attention. That's just great. The problem is they have no theological leg to stand on in Islam, and therefore when they're challenged by the jihadis, and even when their children are recruited by the jihadis, they don't have any answer. The thing is, people have a lot of influences in their lives. Many of you have a religion, but you also have other perspectives, other priorities, other beliefs, and all of these things are complicated in everybody's heart and soul and mind. So that you have a spectrum of belief, knowledge, and fervor. Some people are very knowledgeable and very devout, whatever their religion may be, and some people bear the name of the religion, but they couldn't care less, or they don't know, or they're just more interested in something else. That's what moderate Muslims really are. They are people who just want to live their lives. If you talk about Muslims who are aware that the Quran and the example of Muhammad and Islamic law all teach warfare and conquest and subjugation of unbelievers, and who reject that, and who say that must not be done, you're talking about maybe 5 or 10 people. I mean worldwide, out of 1.6 billion. Zuhdi Jasser and his friends. If you want to talk about actual Muslim reformers, it is exactly that way. But if you want to talk about Muslims who just aren't going to take up arms against us at any time, well, that's millions upon millions of people. The problem is, when the chips are down, where will they side? They will side with the Muslims who are waging war. That is where their allegiance is. They probably won't do anything. But to base our foreign policy and our domestic policy, our immigration policy, to base the future of our nation, to base our children's lives on the idea that the vast majority of Muslims don't want to do this, don't care about jihad and conquest and subjugation, and that somehow some large group of Muslims who are moderates are going to rise up and fight against the jihadis and stop them, that is not only foolish, that is suicidal.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, I have several questions, so please now in the next few rounds, a little bit briefer answers, but just as wise, please. But I have a feeling that before my new questions, the wise men want to follow up a little bit. So let's start with Raymond. Briefly,
sure.
please.
The moderate, to go back to the moderate radical dichotomy that we believe exists, one thing that I've also noticed, because I follow very much the Arab media and the Arabic world and see what's going on there, it's those, I've often found that the moderate Muslims, to use that word, who are actually having an influence, whose lives are in danger, are the ones that you probably never hear of. These are the ones who are actually in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Al-Azhar, and so forth. I'm not trying to exonerate Al-Azhar because it's full of its own problems, but I've seen and I've heard some of these sheikhs and they talk, and my point is, this is really where the debate is. It's there. And these moderates who you don't know about are the ones who are sort of in the thick of it. Now, the reason I bring that up is because the flip side of that is the moderates in America, I think, are not only ineffective in the bigger debate of the Islamic world, they actually have the potential to basically lower the West's guard, because what they are, the moderates in America, are completely discounted in the Islamic world. They never even heard of them, the people who are living in the Middle East. And if they do hear of them, they just see them as, okay, these are just, sort of American-washed, if you will, or Western-washed Muslims doing whatever they have to do to make a buck. And in the end, it even helps the Islamic world's image, the moderates, the so-called moderates in America who do this. And then who listen? I mean, the audience of the moderate Muslims in America, it's not Muslims, it's us. And that's the danger, because then so many people in America, they listen to these moderates, it sounds good, the moderates offer sort of a Western paradigm that is very palatable to Western sensibilities, and it sounds great, and then we start believing, okay, there's hope, it's going to change, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, these guys have zero influence on the real debate over there. And so I think there's a little bit of danger in the so-called moderate Muslims. And I'm not doubting their sincerity or whatever the case may be. I just know for a fact these guys count for almost nothing there. And that's where it's at. This is where the world of Islam is. This is where, the debate is going on. It's not here, and yet they're here talking to us when they should be over there talking to them, and then too many of us start listening to them. And I think that's just something to be cognizant of and aware.
Thank you, Raymond. Bruce?
A couple of points. One, something Robert said is, remember that when a Muslim condemns, a radical Muslim condemns terrorism, in his mind is not what's the same thing in our mind. And the real experts at this over the years has been the PLO, that we have retooled as the PA, the Palestinian Authority after Oslo. It's the PLO, and it's Fatah. It's the terrorist organization. So they say, oh, yeah, so of course we condemn terrorism. They mean Israeli police shooting rubber bullets at rock-throwing urchins, right? What Muslims do is not terrorism in their mind. It's an Orwellian use of language so that they can say, of course we condemn terrorism. Terrorism is wrong. But in their mind, it's not terrorism. And many in the West have gone along with that. And they say, oh, no, that's national resistance. And look at the history of Protocol I to the Geneva Convention, which Ronald Reagan was smart enough not to sign. But I think Obama has de facto ratified that, with the Palestinians in mind, said the rule about having to wear uniforms to be subject to Geneva Conventions doesn't count for people who are in fights of national resistance, resistant movements. We're going to exclude them. And you look at the history of that was the Soviet Union behind that, with an eye on the PLO, so that they would get the Geneva Convention rights that by law they don't deserve. And again, Ray, I think, is completely right. But let me really quickly, I remember being at a discussion like this a few years ago, and there was somebody from the Netherlands, and I feel bad, I don't remember his name, and I don't think you can help me on this one. If you do, I'm going to be amazed. But somebody came up, a kind of semi-apologist, and he was making the argument that, Ray was talking about Muslims make. And I remember his first name was Bart, and Bart said he said, that's kind of interesting. All I want is for them to behave. In other words, I don't care what their little, theological debates are about this verse and that verse. Our only concern should be what advances the security and interest of this country and its allies. And we should not try to get into these debates about the nature of Islam. It's simply just behave. And then you guys sort it out. It's your business. And if you can't sort it out, then there will be consequences.
Thank you. I really want to get to some questions, but Robert, go ahead, some final thoughts on this round.
Well, Bruce mentioned condemnations, and so, you know, a lot of people might have been thinking when I was saying there's no moderate Islam that, well, all these Muslim groups that have been condemning the Islamic State left and right and saying it's not Islamic, and all these Muslim leaders all over the place. So this needs to be addressed. In the first place, the Muslim groups in the United States are universally, all the major ones, Muslim Brotherhood groups. The Muslim Brotherhood sees the Islamic State as a competitor. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in order to restore the caliphate. They had their best chance with the Morsi regime in Egypt. They blew it. But then this other group, this upstart al-Qaeda group, starts a caliphate and stole their thunder. So, of course, they condemn the Islamic State because they're competitors with it, not because they are in principle against what the Islamic State is doing. And, of course, a lot of this is just plainly deceptive. The most ironic and stupid thing about, well, there's so many competitors, I shouldn't say the most ironic and stupid thing about U.S. policy, but a very stupid thing about U.S. policy is the constant refrain that people say, we can't call these people Islamic because that will just dignify them and that will get them more supporters in the Islamic world. Well, the news is Muslims don't care what non-Muslims think about Islam. In the Quran, non-Muslims are called the most vile of created beings and likened to cattle. And the Muslims are called the best of people in the world. Do you think that the best of people in the world are going to listen to Barack Obama? And say that I'm a Muslim and I'm thinking, maybe I should go to Iraq and join the Islamic State. Oh, but then John Kerry said they weren't Islamic. I guess I better not.
Yeah.
It's wildly absurd.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I just, and now I sorry to repeat this, but let's now try to make this a little bit more of a 1 or 2 minute chat for each person because I want to get to some stuff. I'm very interested in denial in general. For instance, in my life, being from the former Soviet Union, I was very interested in this psychology. The Rosenbergs and Algerhis were innocent, 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 innocent. You argue, 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 argue. Finally, you prove they're guilty, and then the leftist says, but at least they didn't snitch. and there's somewhere where the discussion is never really about the discussion. So I want to ask you something. Let's just begin with this in terms of the Islamic side. For instance, I'm down on 3rd Street Promenade often doing some public outreach with the Counter-Jihad Coalition, and we'll debate with Muslims. The exchanges are usually very interesting because there's a lot of denial and then I get physically threatened. But let me ask this. As a Christian, for instance, I kind of more or less know what's in the New Testament, what's in the Old Testament. If I'm arguing with somebody, I don't say, oh, that's not in there. Because if somebody mentions what, you know, Matthew, Luke, such and such is, it's there. Can you just briefly touch on this construct of you don't know Arabic, then when you show them the Arabic translation, you're taking it out of context. But they also seem, a lot of the Muslims that, you know, I have exchanges with, they don't know what's in the Hadith and the Quran, or they pretend they don't know. What is this all about? Because in the end, for instance, I've had such long arguments, and in the end, I usually get something like, how much are they paying you? or you don't need to read Quran. You know, like, it always ends up to be about something else. What's going on? Let's start with Raymond.
Sure, Jamie. That's a good question. A lot of people, for example, are not familiar with when it comes to Islam, you're supposed to recite the Quran in the Arabic, and the majority of Muslims in the world are not Arabic speakers. So a big chunk of these people are just parroting and reciting words that they have no idea what it means. The concept and what you discussed too about the hadith and these other sacred scriptures are also, they're accessible now via internet as opposed to earlier times. But again, a lot of people don't know. But the one fact that you know is that the more a person or a Muslim becomes learned in Islamic lore and teaching, the more they read it in the Arabic and they understand what's going on, the more they become pious, they become Islamic supremacists, terrorists, jihadis, all the bad things that we're talking about. And this is an undeniable fact. I was reading a recent study that said, and this is common sense, but of course nowadays we always need a study to help us understand common sense. But the study basically said that something like 99.9% of all Muslims who join Islamic jihadi groups became very pious in the years before. Surprise. But that's the whole point. I mean, this is, and why is that? Because if you look at the text, if you read it, all of this stuff is there. And, you know, a good point to remember, and it's ironic, we always talk about, for example, you know, of the defamation laws, and I'll be very brief. The defamation where, you know, OIC and the Islamic organizations want to ban insulting religions and so forth. And it's amazing to me because what they're talking about is a guy in the West who draws a cartoon, writes a book, etc., and that, you know, well, it leads to chaos, mayhem, death, murder, slaughter, etc. But if you look at the core text of Islam, they defame every other religion in unequivocal terms more than any of the cartoons that you see. Christianity is condemned by name, the Trinity is condemned, Judaism is condemned by name, and then the pagans, which of course is the umbrella group for Hindus, Buddhists, and so forth. And it's ironic, so here you have the core text of a whole religion that constantly defames and incites violence, and yet we're worried about cartoons that are by individuals who represent only themselves, and here you have the core text. And so you'd be surprised to learn, and I think this is a good move, that in places, for example, like in Russia, they're actually banning some of the core key texts of Islam, such as Sahih Bukhari, which is seen as the second most important book in Islamic, right after of the Quran. And their logic is simple. It incites violence. It incites supremacism. I think that's a legitimate concern. I think if we ban books because of those reasons, because they do incite terrorism and so forth, you should start right there with the Quran and all of Islam's core text.
Bruce?
Yeah, I don't know, you know, the scenario you're describing of the individuals. I would guess that, I think as Ray said, that a lot of these people really don't know. Because when they do know, and they know the truth of what Islam teaches, then as he says, they start taking it seriously. Now, we can use an analogy, you know, up in the valley at the university I teach at Fresno, we have more kids who are practicing Christians, okay? But if you start to quiz them on the theology of Christianity, which is 2,000 years of extremely sophisticated, complex thinking about the doctrines of Christianity, they don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. And I imagine the same must be true for many Muslims. But here's the difference. What they do know about Christianity is, you know, the Good Samaritan, Jesus died for your sins, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So you can get by on that, and it's a very positive message, basically, of love. That's not the case in Islam. And the key, I think, that Raymond puts his finger on is supremacy. They are supremacists. They are the best of nations created for the benefit of all mankind. It is their destiny to rule the world because what they believe would make a better world for everybody. And if they don't know anything, they will have inherited that sense of innate superiority. And that, I think, is the problem. You're not going to argue them out of that. You're going to have to knock it out of them. The way the slavocracy of cavaliers and slave owners, plantation, or the minority of all the Southerners at the time, had to have that humiliation of Sherman's march through Georgia to sort of get their minds right.
Thank you, Bruce. Robert?
The extent of the ignorance among Muslims of the actual teachings of the Quran and Muhammad cannot be overstated. It really is quite extensive because, as Raymond noted, you have to pray in Arabic, and most Muslims today are not Arabs. And anyway, it's 7th century classical Arabic, which is not quite modern standard Arabic either. So it's very remote from something that you actually just read and understand. I was talking to a Pakistani Muslim a few years ago, and he said, I'm very proud of my religion, and I've memorized almost all of the Quran. And one day I intend to get one of those translations and find out what it means.
Okay, so...
One other thing, though, it has to also be noted very quickly that what Jamie's talking about also involves deception. The Quran says, don't take unbelievers as your friends and protectors in preference to believers, unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them. And the great Quran commentator Ibn Kathir from the Middle Ages, whose work is still widely read today and widely cited among Muslims, commentary on the Quran, on that verse he says, He quotes one of Muhammad's early companions saying, this means we smile in the faces of some people and behind their backs we curse them. And it's permitted to deceive unbelievers for the benefit of Islam. That's what he's encountering to a tremendous degree when Muslims just flatly deny to your face that what is on the page is there.
Thank you. Please, this under 60 seconds, please, but I just want to narrow in on 3 things that I constantly encounter and just want your insight on the psychology of it. What is the psychology here? Because I get this 30 times an evening on 3rd Street. We have a poster and it has ISIS beheading a person, and there's some quotes from the Quran that justify it. And the Muslim says to me, this is not Islam. There's 4 or 5 exchanges, and he starts walking away and goes, if this is still here when I get back, shh. Right? So, under 60 seconds, please, what is the psychology of that? Because we can laugh, but this is actually real, and I'm actually fascinated with this psychology that stop saying that Islam is not peaceful. If you don't stop, I'll kill you. What is the psychology? Under 60 seconds, please.
Okay.
Bruce? Oh, no, Raymond, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I mean, to address it in under 60 seconds, what I have to explain real quick about Islam is it's a paradigm that was built on might makes right historically. This is what it was all about. Islam's appeal is it beat people on the battlefield, it plundered them, it enslaved them, and that was something that until today in Arab schools they teach the, as I call them, the openings, which is really the bloody conquest of the early Islamic conquests, and they're portrayed as a wonderful thing. The time that Islam was on a retreat was I'd give it a rough estimate, from the 1850s to the 1950s, and that was because the West not only beat it on the battlefield, but that was a time when the West had some confidence in itself, and if anything, confidence attracts, or power attracts Muslims. That's how Islam started. And this is the era where so many Muslims, Islam was about to die, basically. If you think about the Ottoman Empire, and this was the standard jihadi bearer of the Islamic world, that was the #1 country that became so westernized, so secularized, they actually got rid of the Arabic script and adapted the Roman alphabet. And the point is, they saw the West and how it was, and it was dominant, it was unapologetic, and they felt we have to be like that. That's the Muslim mentality. Now, it's the opposite. Because of the West's, whatever word you want to use, liberalism, lack of faith in itself, godlessness, whatever, it's now pushing Muslims away from trying to emulate. So it's gone from emulation to contempt. And it's exacerbated, of course, by the fact that all the elites in the West tell Muslims how wonderful the religion is and how they should embrace it, et cetera, et cetera. So now it's from making Muslims want to be like the West, we are pushing them out of our way so they can become and embrace the Islamic Jihad. So that's part of the warped mentalities you're alluding to.
Thank you. The psychology I illustrated, and I'll try a new tactic. Bruce, under 5 seconds.
Cognitive dissonance. No, they're spiritual. They're in a spiritual mentality, and we come at it from an enlightenment, rational sort of evidence, materialistic, and they're in a spiritual, and you can have those kinds of contradictions within a spiritual sort of universe that they live in.
Okay, Robert?
It's all about slander. Slander in Islam is not lying about somebody. According to Islamic law, slander is making known something about someone that he does not want known. And so the guy doesn't want Muslims to know, non-Muslims to know that those beheadings are Islamic, but he knows they are. So he tells Jamie, take that down or I'll cut you. There's no contradiction at all.
Wow.
He wants the deception to remain.
Thank you, Robert. Now, we also get accused by the Unholy Alliance. We get it from the left all the time. I'm always surprised at how much millions of dollars I'm getting in back alleys getting passed to me in envelopes. There's always this thing about the money that the left uses. But just also very quickly, just the psychology, and we'll move on. I get this a lot. They'll take me to the side and they'll go, they paying you a lot, yeah? A lot of money? And I get that constantly. Just very quickly, this slander of us that it's all about money. We get it from the left, but we also get it very much from the Islamic sphere. What is this accusation of money and that we're paid? Is it to erase that there's real humanitarianism involved, or that we care?
Bruce.
You want Bruce?
What they're saying is you are in the pay of the vast Zionist conspiracy. Right. This is the old protocols of the Elder Zion slander, is what we're talking about. And you're right, it has crept over onto the West also. When they over this Iran unfolding disaster with Iran, and I forget who it was mentioned donors. It may have been Obama said, "Oh, it's, you know, you may want to do this because of your donors." Everybody knew what he was talking about, right? He was saying the Jewish lobby, the vast, great, you know, control that 2% of the population has over the whole world, right? So that's just a recycle. It's a recycling of that nonsense.
Raymond?
Well, I can't really add more to that.
Okay. Robert, you want to say something?
Yeah, in the Quran and in Islamic tradition, there's no idea of unbelievers acting in good faith, especially those who are actually trying to oppose the spread of Islam. They are perverse, they know better, they know that Islam is true, and nonetheless, because they have some ulterior motive, getting money, getting fame, whatever, they continue to pursue it. There's a story of these Christians going to see Muhammad, and on the way, the leader of the Christians tells the rest of the group, "We know this man's a prophet. We know that he's true, but the Byzantines are paying us good money to fight against him, and so when we get there, we have to resist him every step of the way." And see, they're just venal and dishonest, and this is the portrayal of unbelievers all through Islamic tradition. This, if you're a Muslim growing up with these kinds of stories, of course you're going to think that all of us, we know better, but we're in it for the dough.
Thank you. Okay, let me ask this, because we deal a lot with jihad denial, and I think we're all aware that jihad denial enables jihad. In other words, if we weren't engaged in denial, I think we would agree that the Tsarnaevs would not have been able to do what they did. I think that Nidal Hassan wouldn't have been able to do what he did. So I think that there's definitely a complicity in jihad by those who deny jihad. However, we very much want there to be truth-telling. But let's suppose that tomorrow Obama just comes out and says, there's a problem with Surah 9.5, there's a problem with Surah 9.29, and Islamic theology, you know, it buffers, it sanctions, it mandates jihad, and, you know, blah, 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 blah. Wouldn't that be such an inflammatory situation at the same time where it would cause such a collision? And I'm obviously playing the devil's advocate here, but there is an argument to be said that it would bring on and inflame a gigantic conflict, and do we need to be maybe in some ways more strategic? Raymond?
Well, I mean, my initial answer is better now than later.
So in other words, let's get it on.
Let's get it, well, my thing, and when I'm asked these sorts of questions, is I'm guided by truth. Get the truth out. You know, whatever the consequences will be, they will be, and I'm sure they won't be very pretty. But if you, I mean, not to be a cliche, the truth will set us free. But so if you get the truth out and stop all the dissembling that we get constantly, it's eventually going to come out. And what we're doing is actually, by wasting time and playing this game and not getting the truth out, you're letting the other side get stronger all the time.
Okay, 1 second. But Raymond, let's suppose that there's millions and millions of Muslims that, as we said, actually don't even know what's in the Quran, and they're just kind of maybe walking around, and all of a sudden the leader of the United States starts actually saying something quote-unquote bad against their religion. All of a sudden we're inflaming perhaps millions and millions of people.
But this has happened before, and this is what I was referring to. When the West was on the ascendancy, colonial era, a little before that, it's usually marked Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, 1798, and so forth. There was, I mean, if you look at people back then, Europeans and so forth, no one had any doubt what Islam is. I mean, what we're doing, this is a totally superfluous exercise if you took it back 100 years ago, because this was common sense. People knew it. They said it. They understood it. They forced it. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, the European powers told them to abolish the jizya tax and to treat Christians and Jews and so forth as citizens. So they were upfront in their face, and as I said earlier, there's actually a Muslim respect for that sort of thing. They respect that because it's power, they're laying it on the line, and then it's up to them to do what they want to do. Do they want to eliminate that? Do they want to fight back? And if so, good luck.
Okay. So. Bruce, kind of the danger of if we actually get what we want.
Well, the danger is as Ray set it out, and we went through this once before in the 30s, and it's very interesting to look at that segment of the Brits in the 30s who thought that Germany had gotten a raw deal with the Versailles settlement, that they had legitimate grievances, and that we can't really be too critical of them because we're just going to you know, inflamed them and pushed them into the Nazi Party. And there were a lot of people, even at Munich and post-Munich, who said, well, this is our fault, you know, because we didn't address the grievances. It didn't help. It didn't help because Nazism was an ideology of dominance and conquest. And as Ray says, all of that appeasing simply confirmed their estimation that their enemy was weak and could be taken. And this is exactly what we're doing today. We are confirming their estimation that the West is corrupt, it's godless, all it cares about is money and material comfort. And they can see a lot of evidence of that on satellite TV, let's face it. And that, as bin Laden said, we ran from Mogadishu, we ran from Saigon, we run from everywhere. And so if we just push, if we just push, if we just push. And I agree, it just come right out and tell the truth, and let's sort out who's willing to die and who isn't.
Okay. Robert, on denial?
No war in history has ever been won by people engaged in wishful thinking and fantasy and self-deception about the motives and goals of the enemy. Ever. It's not going to happen now either. And moreover, the United States has not been standing for its own principles in this conflict. Imagine how different things would have been if we had gone into Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11 and said, we are standing for and going to protect the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience against the death penalty for apostasy, the equality of rights of women before the law, the equality of rights of non-Muslims with Muslims. And all Muslims who support that, we will protect you and we will help you. There would have been millions of Muslims, I would wager, who would have joined up and supported us on that basis, because there are millions of Muslims who see that in the West and want it, but they are trapped because they have no support and no help and no acknowledgement from the West that they have a good and legitimate cause. There are hundreds of thousands of secret converts from Islam to Christianity or just atheists who are living underground in the Islamic world. If we had come in and said, we're going to protect the rights of apostates from Islam, we could have had hundreds of thousands of people supporting us. But we've never stood up for our own principles in this conflict. If we had been honest from the beginning, I think things would have been very different.
Okay, so let's talk now about the danger and also perhaps the motives behind the denial from the top. So let's crystallize it with this. We have an Al-Qaeda terrorist that goes into a Jewish deli in France. He's in a Jewish deli because it's Jewish. He kills the people in there because they're Jewish. He even makes a phone call to a local station and says that he's there because it's Jewish and he hates Jews. And then there's a president of the United States that says that some guy was just shooting randomly into a crowd. Why is Obama presenting it in this way? Is it because he cares for us and wants to avoid this collision? Or is there a real malicious intent there, Raymond? And what are the dangers of this tactic?
Well, there's a lot there. As I always say when it comes to Obama, and really to any of these officials and authorities, Western officials and authorities, when it comes to the Islam question, and they give you the whole, you know, no, this isn't Islam, and et cetera, there's only two conclusions. Either this person is a complete idiot, or he's a liar, and they're just both as bad. And this is what you have to deal with. A lot of people will say, oh, no, you know, Obama's not a Muslim, or he is a Muslim. That's irrelevant at this point. The fact is, his policies are such that they empower the radical Islamic types. And this is sort of what we need to be cognizant of. But he, of all presidents, and I've said this before, is the one that it would have actually been nice, the one good thing he could have brought to America as a multicultural, ethnic kind of quasi-Muslim, as he portrays himself, is that he does have knowledge of Islam. This man went to the madrasas in Indonesia. His father is a Kenyan. He knows Islam, and instead of all the presidents, it seems he's the one who's giving us the whitewashed, politically correct, multiculturalist view. Yeah. And that to me means I think he's lying about it.
Right.
And, you know, but like I said, in the end result, whether you have a fool who's saying that we need to get job opportunities to ISIS,
okay,
or whether you have someone who's lying out their teeth, it's the same thing.
Thank you, Raymond. So, Bruce, this is also an administration where the Muslim Brotherhood front groups came in the early part of the Obama years and said, we don't like this in your FBI manuals, take it out. And they take it out. They take out all references to jihad, they take out all references to Islam and FBI training manuals. This is also an administration that did not pursue Muslim Brotherhood front groups that were named in the Holy Land Foundation trial. So I guess I'm narrowing in on quote-unquote malicious intent.
I don't know, and I don't care. I don't find it interesting to try to divine individual motives. I do know, however, the reigning ideology of the world Obama came from. It wasn't Kenya. It was the American university. And I'm telling you, you want to understand Barack Obama, I can reach into any university in this country blindfolded and pull out 5 English professors who think exactly like Barack Obama does on every single issue. And what this is reflecting is, one, the Marxist demonization of the West, of liberal democracy and capitalism as imperialist. That has become second nature to them. So
Just a sec, I'm just
the
going
West
to
is
interrupt. I'm just going to
wrong.
interrupt for a second. But you just said that you don't care about motives, but those are motives.
No, I'm talking about a larger idea. I mean individuals. I don't want to talk about individuals.
Okay.
What an individual's motives may be. I want to talk about the larger
Right.
culture-wide ideas.
But Obama's motives is exactly that ideology.
That could be it.
Okay.
It could be
okay.
he's a secret Muslim. It could be
Okay,
he's a space
okay.
alien. I don't know.
Okay.
But I should apologize. It's an insult to space aliens. But, okay.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
They're usually a lot nicer. But you have this culture-wide, fashionable idea that the West is wrong, the West has been oppressive. Any person of color that can qualify as a victim of the West gets the benefit of the doubt. It's hate speech to insult them. It's hate speech to criticize them. Throw on to that multiculturalism, which is every culture other than the West is superior, more authentic, more just, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we cannot insult particularly a culture of color. And that brings us then to the identity politics that dominates the university and a lot of our... Anybody who can be certified as a victim of the United States or of the West immediately gets the benefit of the doubt. Immediately. To criticize them, even to speak truth about them. And we see this with other ethnic minorities. You can be called a racist for stating something, some of the things that we heard the sheriff say today. But here's another one. Black men kill more black men in 1 year than were lynched in the whole history of lynching. Right? But to say something like that is to be racist. You see what I mean? So you throw all those cultural trends together that are dominant in the university, and you consider the time spent in the university by Obama. To me, that's scarier, because if it's just Obama, he's going to be gone. But it's much wider than that.
Thank you, Bruce. And so just to lead into Robert, how I see it is, let's say there's me and 5 people, and we hate a certain building, and we get to rule that building for a little while, and we just start destroying everything in the building. And there's 30 days left, and we're just sitting around saying we have 30 days left to destroy everything in here. Now, what are we going to go at next? That's what I think is happening. Robert?
Yeah, you know, in the 2008 campaign, there was a photograph that was widely distributed of Barack Obama walking from one place to another with his finger in the book, The Post-American World by Fareed Zakaria. And it was clear that he was engrossed in the book, he was keeping his place, he wanted to get back to reading it as soon as he could. And that book says the problem in the world is America, that there shouldn't be no superpowers, and that America should be weakened or weaken itself politically, militarily, and economically, and then all the nations will be essentially equal and there will be harmony and peace. Now, has he not pursued that as a strategy all through his presidency? Pamela Geller and I wrote the book, The Post-American Presidency, based on exactly this proposition in 2010, and we've been abundantly proven correct that this is what his agenda is. And also remember, he said, the future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam, and slander in Islam is not telling lies, it's telling truths that people don't want known. And so that's what he's doing. He's obfuscating and denying about the nature of this problem, avoiding slandering Islam.
Before we go, actually, I just want one name or one word in terms of truth tellers. because it gives us hope that at least that there's still some heroes. In our media, you know, somebody that gives me a lot of inspiration is Sean Hannity, in the sense of even his bravery of who he invites on to tell the truth. Can you give us one name of somebody that gives you hope in our culture and media that's telling the truth, Robert? Is there anyone?
Can you go to the other guys?
Raymond? Well, it's a very sad state of affairs then, right? Yeah. Raymond?
I'm sorry to say, I really don't even watch the news. I get my news and information from different sources, but I can't even sit.
It's
watch
how bad
it's
it is.
It's like a zoo.
Yeah. Rush Limbaugh? Bruce? Bruce?
Yeah, all of those guys, you're absolutely right. The problem is the people that are listening to them, in the most part, already agree with them. Mm-hmm. You know, and what we have to do is try to figure out some way to get beyond, you know, our choir to proselytize among the heathen, you know, and I don't know how you do that. Yeah. And I don't know who's out there that could do that, because immediately any of us that does that will be put into the box of right-wing nuts, or, you know, stooges for Israel, or the oil companies, or whatever.
Well, we're looking forward to the day when Anderson Cooper has a one-hour discussion with Robert Spencer.
There was an article in The Atlantic, of all places, about the Islamic State being Islamic by Graham Wood. And so I had never heard of Graham Wood before, but there's the guy. It was honest and in the mainstream. Astonishing. I fainted.
I'm sorry. I'm not Michael. Wait.
All right.
Because he mentioned this Graham Wood article, and here's what really irritated me, is the response of some so-called conservatives to this article as though it were a revelation. Finally, what, the Atlantic said it.
Must be true.
Here's two guys right here who have been saying this for 10 years. And you've got Peggy Noonan saying, oh my gosh. I mean, our side have some problems as well in this regard.
Final word, Michael Finch.
All four of these, can I use the words titans, Jamie? All four of these titans have books for sale out there, so please get one of their books, they'll sign it. We're going to have lunch in 15 minutes down the hall where we had breakfast with Victor Davis Hanson, so we'll see you then. Thank you, Jamie.